Hello, my name is Austin. This is Blackwood Custom, and today I'm walking you through how I built this RPG Dungeons and Dragons style game table. All right, the first thing that we wanted to do was tape out this design of the table onto the floor so I could at least get my bearings. I had no idea where to start, so I said, hey, let's just start by taping it out, measured up on the concrete floor of my shop, and the blue tape is the tabletop. And the colored tape, yellow and red here, is going to be the sub base. So I kind of just taped it up how I designed it on Illustrator, and just started throwing it together. Laid out some boards, kind of get my bearings here, and just get going with it. Tacked together these long boards once I kind of figured out what I wanted to do. But as you'll see later in the video, I actually rebuilt this entire sub base because I was off by a couple degrees of an angle, which over the course of 10 feet is several inches, and there was just a big old gap in the middle. So chopped up some pieces. As you can see, I'm going through this pretty quickly, but just tacked together these kind of skeletonized frames. Wanted to figure out what I wanted to do with this cubby system. It's super important to have a cubby underneath the table where you could put pieces of paper and players and little game pieces. So I just kind of made some arms that extended from the skeleton. And what I ended up doing was taking just about a full piece of plywood here, like that, and I put it on top of the skeleton. And that full piece of plywood is just going to be the support of the cubby. Now, it's not going to be really heavy, weight-bearing cubby, because just piece of papers and maybe iPads, computers, stuff like that. But I still wanted it to be supported, and the best way I could think of doing that was using a full piece of plywood stretched underneath the sub base, so that way with the weight of the table on it, it's going to be tacked into the actual base, so it's good to go. Now, obviously, I had to flush it up with the sub base, so went ahead and used my track saw, cut off all those extra limbs hanging out of there. Perfect. And this is what our one half of the sub base is going to look like. This entire table, we had to build it in 6 parts. So there's 2 tabletop parts, 2 sub base parts, and 2 base pieces. We did it this way so that way we could get it into the client's home where he is building this game room. Had to be able to fit through doors. And now, like any good role-playing game table, there has to be a headmaster seat. The game master, the dungeon master, sits at the head of the table, and he or she's gonna have their own cubby as well to store the really important kind of game making pieces. Now, I don't know a whole lot about the game myself, so I can't speak to the details, but I know that having a person in charge of the entire campaign, the entire game that's going on, is vital to the success of that game. So what we're doing here is we're just creating a cubby system for that game master, so that way he or she has place to put all of their pieces and crucial game important stuff. On the woodworking side, essentially this is just a box, okay? Butt jointed up, tacked together with brad nails and glue, and you'll see some screws here in just a minute. And what this is gonna be is just gonna be an open format box. But like I said, this table's in 6 different pieces, right? 2 table pieces for the sub base and for the top of the table. So what was I going to do with this one? So I guess technically it's in 7 pieces. What I wanted this to do is stretch the entire width of the game master seating area, so that way there's not a divider right down the middle. So if this was built into the sub base directly, then there would be a hard line in the middle, right? So I wanted this to be a uniform piece, so there's no ridges or joints in the middle of this cubby, just so ease of use and smooth. So we went ahead and just kind of tacked this together like that using glues and brad nails. And now you'll see me trying to figure out, okay, so we're going to attach this directly to the sub base. What's the best way to do that? And again, we ended up rebuilding the sub base later on, but it appeared right now the best way to do it is, hey, we're going to clamp this thing in place. We're going to drill some holes, and through those holes, we're going to put in a threaded insert into the sub base piece of plywood, into the skeleton. And then through the Game Master cubby directly, we could bolt it in place with some 1/4 inch bolts into those threaded inserts that were drilled into the sub base system. Now, I didn't think this was quite strong enough, so I went ahead and I got some aluminum from the store. This is at a 90 degree, and what I wanted to do was kind of use this aluminum to support this Game Master cubby. So what I ended up doing was just cutting it directly in with a circular saw into the plywood in the sub base. You'll see here in just a minute. And so part of it, here we go. So we're going to cut through the plywood in the sub base right here. And then I wanted this piece to be supported into the sub base, and it's going to be holding up the weight of the Game Master cubby along with those threaded inserts and bolts that are in the sub base as well. This might be overkill, but I thought, hey, maybe this cubby itself might have some extra weight in it. And so went ahead and added this support system in place there. So you'll see here in just a second what I'm talking about. It might be kind of confusing right now. But you'll see I slide that aluminum in place just like that, hammer it in, and now I have a bracket that's essentially holding in this entire cubby in place. So if we push down on it, at least it has some extra support within the sub base because it's built independent of the sub base itself. And again, do the same thing to the other side. Had to use the mallet on this one. Nice tight fit. And went ahead and just kind of drilled some screws in there. So that way it just wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't gonna fall out or anything, but I'd rather have some vertical support holding it in place. Some actual hardware. Okay, so here we're actually gonna tape out the actual base itself. This is what the table's going to sit on. You'll see a crucial design flaw here in just a minute or two. When we built it, actually, let's see if you can point out the design flaw yourself. And later on in the video, I'm going to show you exactly what I did to correct that design flaw. So right now, I'm just kind of taping out a rough image of what I want this to look like. Kind of looks like a coffin, but underneath the table, it looks very clean. And we're going to go ahead and build this entire base out of 2x4s. Now, 2x4s themselves might be overkill. I mean, you frame houses with 2x4s. But I'm putting 10 square feet, about 100 board feet of cherry on top of this, along with a plywood subbase. So I wanted to make sure it was supported. So went ahead and kind of just used some relative angles here, relative measuring, to tack together again in two pieces this base because it has to be able to fit through doors in my client's home and be able to deliver easily. And as you can see, I drive a Tacoma, so I don't have a big old hunkin' trailer or anything. I have a little 5-foot bed, but hey, we made it work. So in this part, I'm just kind of going through, hey, what do I want this to look like? How do I want the pieces to be aligned? What angles do we need? Okay, let's stitch it all together. And just went through, and it's actually really simple using that relative measurement. Just this angle follows this angle following the tape that we taped out. Using the tape, I think, is a brilliant idea if you're ever going to do something similar to this and you don't want to do all the math to find the angles. Just go ahead and tape out your design. And then I just went ahead and cut the angles until they worked on the miter saw. And they fit together just like this. Again, I glued, screwed, and brad nailed these. Screws would have been plenty, but I always like gluing joints because, I don't know, as a woodworker, we like to glue things. And now I'm just going to add that center support piece. That's going to be that center line that splits the entire base all the way down the table, as you can see here. And again, just relative measuring, making sure that the pieces are snug up against each other, taking a pencil, marking that line, and then making the cut. So I don't need to do any actual measurements here. Didn't use the measuring tape, just kind of push pieces up against each other. It's a really great way to making sure your pieces are snug and fit with one another. Of course, you can design everything you want from the get-go, but sometimes maybe you forget about a board thickness here or a board thickness there or something. And your measurements a little bit off. So relative measurements, great way to do it. And again, glued, screwed, and brad nailed together. Brad nails are really just there to hold it together, so when I screw it, it doesn't go sliding or gaps come apart. This angle was a little weird. Ended up flushing off that kind of extra piece there, if you can see it, but it ended up working out okay. And then again, just relative measuring, making sure that piece was square to the rest of them. Built 2 of these sub base pieces, but as you can see, I only recorded the building of 1 of them. Okay, now I'm just gonna chop up some plywood. Now this plywood's gonna be the wrap around the base. So as you can see, it's kind of all folded down right here. But we'll get back to that plywood in just a minute. What I'm doing right here is just bracketing where the base is going to go into the tabletop. I thought it would be a good idea if I did this now rather than when all the plywood and the legs were on this base, because I just have it as an independent piece. And as you can see, it's quite rainy outside. Kind of makes it soothing for some woodworking. Nice cool air coming in. And here I'm drilling these pieces, and I'm going to add a T-nut on one side and a big old bolt on the other side. That way we can sync these pieces together, so that way they stay square when we build everything else. Okay, so here's the plywood. Chopped up some legs that were at the right height, about 25¼ inches, maybe a little less. No, I think 25¼ inches. And then I put them on the inside, just tacked them in briefly with some 2-inch brad nails, and then went around and ended up adding some pilot holes and then actually screwed them in place here. And then I took off another 3.5 inches from another piece, just the width of a 2x4 here. Took off an extra 3.5 inches and added those to the legs that were coming up, so that way our plywood would have a flush surface to sit against when it wraps all the way around. So that way it could flush the frame down on the bottom and then also the legs. So glued and brad nailed these. Did not screw the plywood in place because this would be something that you can see, so we didn't want any exposed hardware there. So just kind of glued and tacked in place with a brad nailer. Made sure to follow the frame of this base and the legs, and went around and did this, and then did the same thing to the other side of the base. So now what we have is a rough base that looks kind of like a big old coffin. All of our joints at the corners there are open a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back later and we're going to trim them all flush with some MDF and paint that black. But we just kind of want to get this roughly built for right now, so we could put our sub base on it, and then maybe we could start constructing the tabletop with a base. I ended up moving this because this was in an inconvenient location for my shop right next to the miter saw station. So we moved it over to the tape later on here, but just take a look. That's what the sub base looks like. And if you can see that gap in between the two boards, yeah, that was a problem. Ended up becoming a lot bigger problem. So we got rid of that. Again, later on in the video, I'll show you. Added that cubby, and let's go get some hardwood. So picked up some S4S cherry. I think this is 1x6, so 1 by 5.5 inches. Yeah, this is 1x6 S4S. See, I usually buy S4S directly from the lumber store just because I don't have an industrial jointer or planer. So milling up all this lumber on my own would just take hours and hours with my little DeWalt planer. So buy S4S if you don't have a joiner or planer. It's great. The guys at the lumberyard usually take care of the boards for you. And you can also pick out the lumber you want and have them S4S it for you. That's just giving you an even surface on all 4 sides of the board. And then, of course, you can take it from there. So what I've been doing here is I've just been chopping up all those boards that I got from the lumberyard to specific lengths. Now, we're not creating a perfect rectangle or perfect square table, so I want to minimize waste as much as possible. So I went ahead and designed on my computer what the lengths of the boards will need to be in order to create the close, rough outline of our shape, as you'll see here. So I lay out the boards on the tape, so that way I know what the board's going to look like when I go and glue them up. And then I'm going to mark out my lines here for my biscuits. So just marking out some biscuit lines so that way I can keep these in line with one another. I have all these boards taped up. I know the order that they need to go in, and I'm gluing up 1/2 at a time. So then I go ahead and I want to keep it as simple as possible. So I just used the T-square there and drywall square and drew lines directly across so that way I can align it back up when it's time to glue up, and added biscuits. Now biscuits are a great way to keep your boards in line with one another. That's either shifting side to side or up and down when they're in the glue and in clamps. Now remember, glue is a little bit slippery, so it's going to act as a lubricant on those boards. So biscuits are just going to keep it in line so it doesn't want to get away from you. And I have to admit, this might not be the prettiest way to do a glue up, but it was pretty efficient. I took a scraper. I kid you not, about 45 minutes after this glue up, I saw a TikTok of an awesome glue roller that spits out the glue for you while you're rolling it, and I thought it was brilliant, and it's gigantic, so I ordered one, and I got that in time for another glue up that I needed, so great. Yeah, add your biscuits in, glue them up, make sure that we're in line, and it ended up working out great. So had just enough clamps. I'm a big fan of pipe clamps, but I also use some parallel clamps here. Big fan of those too, but they're really expensive, so let's just stick with the pipe clamps and add some parallel clamps on the top. I always like to have clamps on the bottom and top because sometimes when you just squeeze from one direction, that tends to want to bow, and so the other direction can kind of counteract that. Okay, now here, remember our table is an odd shape right here in the bottom right corner. So I'm going to create a template out of 1/4-inch plywood of this weird shape. And then I'm going to take off 4 inches all the way around the perimeter, because that 4 inches is what we're going to use for our trim. Our trim is 4 inches thick. So I'm drawing up this strange shape all around here. And then I'm coming back and I'm retracing it. Look at that. Inside path, offset that path by 4 inches all the way on the inside of this template. And what I did was chop it up, taped it together, and now we have ourselves a template. And of course, split it right down the middle so that way we can have 1/2 and then roll it over and do the other half, and they're exactly the same. Went ahead and chopped this up with the track saw. So that way, perfect. And we're not going to worry about if we cut through the biscuits or anything, because remember, we are adding trim to the outside of this. So I wasn't worried about biscuit placement at all, but if you're doing something and then you're cutting it again at an angle, think about biscuit placement and where those lines might be. Maybe trace it out before the glue up, so that way you can put your biscuits in a position where they're not going to get cut through with the saw. Just a tip to keep in mind. And these inside corners like this, obviously you can't take the track saw all the way into the table, so finished it up with a jigsaw. And then just flushed it up with a chisel here. All right. Now once we got it flushed up with the chisel, I'm using that block as a 90-degree reference. It is jointed, so that makes it nice. And I'm just gonna keep cleaning it up with the chisel, make sure it looks pretty. Okay, we have our rough shape. Look at that. Again, it kind of looks like a spaceship, or that symbol from the song, What Does a Fox Say? Okay, I did not cut the end pieces with the template because I wanted them to be even, so I made one cut across both pieces there. We're going to rip some cherry down, so that we're going to use this as our trim along the outside edge of the table. Now we ripped down some maple as well. So we rip down cherry and maple, and then we're going to add those together to create our outside trim pieces, so that way we're not exposing end grain of length, end grain of the board, as our thickness edge, if that makes sense. So we have our cherry and maple, and I'm just going to go through and mark biscuits again and biscuit them all together. Again, saves lots of time sanding. You're going to spend a lot more time trying to sand that out rather than put in the biscuits. So if you don't have a biscuit joiner, I definitely suggest getting one. They're fantastic. Went ahead and threw these all in clamps, made sure they all fit. Okay, perfect. And of course, glued them up, threw in the biscuits, and tightened up those clamps. Now these trim pieces, I need to think of a creative way to attach them to the tabletop body. Okay. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do at this point yet. And I was thinking maybe we just biscuit and glue, but then getting clamps on the strange angles was going to be weird. So I came up with a solution. Some of you may hate it. Some of you may love it. And I'll show you it here in just a second. Obviously got to get through this glue up. Okay, next day, took them out. And I'm just trying to figure out what angles I got to cut these things at. Trimming this all the way around, quite confusing. I am not a professional trim carpenter. And then I realized why I'm not a professional trim carpenter. And that's because when you cut something at an angle, it's going to be a different length on that end piece that you cut than what it originally was. So that's why the hypotenuse of the triangle is always longer than the two legs. It's because it's at an angle and the other two legs are at 90 degrees. So I figured that out the hard way, but I said, hey, that's okay. I'll figure this out. What I'm going to do is we'll just take off that inside maple corner later and inset it with cherry. To correct that, what I could have done is mounted the cherry to the table body first, and then cut it all clean, and then added the outside cherry again. If that's making sense. If it's not making sense, it'll make sense later when I show you how I fixed it. But for right now, just enjoy me tacking on these pieces. What I ended up doing, and my solution was, I'm going to use pocket screws. Now, pocket screws usually aren't used in like fine furniture like this, but I couldn't come up with another way that would get me the board clamped to the table evenly and in line. So I have biscuits that are helping with alignment and pocket screws to screw it into the body of the table. And of course, glue. So gluing it, and then I pocket screw it into the body of the tabletop, and I biscuited them all together and into the body of the tabletop. Now it's unconventional, but it worked. And it's going on the bottom of the tabletop, so I don't think my client will ever see it. We're also going to add a trim piece, and even if he does see it, I think he's going to be okay with it. So, Corey, if you're watching this, thanks for being okay with me using pocket screws. Now, if you saw those strange angles that were kind of poking out, that's what I'm cleaning up here. Again, custom that at an angle, that face is going to be a little bit longer, so then it extrudes out, and boom, cut them all down, flushed it up, so now we have an even surface. I'm ripping down some more cherry here and a little bit more maple, and you'll see why here in just a second. I am going to trim the edges of all the cubbies with cherry. The maple was actually just for a board. I needed to make one more for the trim piece because I cut the angles backwards on it. So this is our Game Master cubby, if you remember. I went ahead and added some cherry as kind of an end cap on it to make it look nice and clean. Looks great. I did mess up with that brad nail. You saw that earlier, but easy fix. Clamped it out. I went ahead and stained all the wood. I'm sorry I didn't get any footage of this. I ran out of storage on the SD card of my camera. But I stained it all this beautiful purple color. This is called dark cherry. I'm using maple plywood, so I stained it that. And now what I'm doing here is I'm ripping down my MDF to create the trim pieces. Now they're 1.5 inches thick each with 3/4 MDF, or excuse me, 1/2 inch MDF. And I am just cutting these all down so I can tack them to the table base. We're back on the base now, no longer on the tabletop. And of course, we had our personal assistant, Bandit. He was giving us a helping paw today. He was kind of the mascot of the day. Not a huge woodworker himself, but he was learning. Went around here, and again, with some relative measuring, just lined up everything that I needed, cut it, and tacked it in place. Bandit was telling me what I was doing right and wrong, and he was actually correct. Tacked everything in with a brad nailer and glue. Went back later, and I'll show you. I filled in all those brad nails just to make sure that it looked okay. But yeah, went around the entire base with MDF. MDF itself is not super strong, but once you add some sort of solvent element to it that's not water-based, some sort of oil-based or latex-based solvent. I don't know if latex is a solvent. That doesn't count. Paint, primer, or finish. The MDF will soak it up and not expand. Water-based, it will expand. It'll soak it up, and it will dry within the wood grain and actually make it harder. That's why you need to coat it several times, but that's because it kind of absorbs it like a sponge. But it'll make the MDF stronger like a plywood would be, or maybe even like a softwood. So cleaned it all up. It paints super well. Added that little door there you saw. Ended up taking it out later, so I didn't show you how I built this, so don't worry about it. I filled in all those holes, and now we're going to create a light box. And you might be saying to yourself, Self, why is he creating a light box? And I'll show you here why. It's a really important element for this table, and it's going to be very, very cool. And I'm extremely proud of it, but didn't have quite the exact dimension melamine laying around, so I went ahead and just kind of tacked these two together, made an 18 by 18 square box here. Again, pocket screws coming in clutch, and you know it. I glued and screwed and brad nailed it all in place. Run around the entire box here, countersinking my screws, because that's the right way to do it. And it looks nice. So go ahead and countersink your screws. And I just lined this entire box with 100 feet of LEDs. I did not think this box would take 100 feet of LEDs, but it did. And there you have it. It's glowing. And we'll get back to that one later. Okay, back to the table base. Taped out the entire table base. So that way we could paint that trim piece, those trim pieces around the edges black. And take a look at that gap. That's disgusting. Here's where we really realized our problem. Once the trim piece was on the tabletop. Yup. As you can see, we got a problem. Okay, let's rebuild this table base. Went ahead, bought some new plywood, chopped it down, made a mistake, took the bullet, but I'm not going to deliver this with that kind of gap in a sub base. That's disgusting. So again, using relative measuring, which we love, I made a new sub base. And the way I did it was essentially very similar to the first way. I just kind of created some ribs for the tabletop to stand on and a cubby made out of plywood just like this. But I used the angles of the actual tabletop itself. And so that way I knew it would be perfect because it's relative to the tabletop. And we just kept everything glued. And we use pocket screws for this because pocket screws work really well for plywood and nobody's ever going to see the inside of this sub base here. So mounted it all up just like this, cut out a little groove for those boxes on the bottom of the table, ended up using those boxes either, but they're there. So wanted to do something about it. Perfect. Okay, now we're taking off that door that I told you about and we're just going to rip off that entire back panel because the Game Master did not have enough legroom. And so, obviously we have to fix that because if you're playing a game for 3 hours, you need legroom. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make a magnetically attached panel here. Now, I'm not going through the exact process of how I build this. If you want to see that, go ahead and see my TikTok at Blackwood Custom. And essentially, I'm just chopped down and trimmed out a piece of plywood for the back panel. That's all it is. Inset the magnets, add a piece of steel, and we had ourselves a little magnet panel. Here, we had another problem. Remember that problem I was telling you about earlier with the base? This is our solution to that problem. Could you figure out what it was? Again, there was not enough legroom. I designed this base too wide. And if you're going to be sitting at a table for 3.5, 4 hours playing a game, you're going to get uncomfortable. So my client and I came up with a solution, and we decided to make legroom cubbies. That's right. We cut into this table base. We created our own cubby system, proprietary to Blackwood Custom. Just kidding, it's a box. And we slid it underneath and trimmed it to the table base, and it's almost like it was designed that way from the get-go. I did not show the trimming here because I ran out of room on my SD card or forgot to turn on the camera, one of the two. But that's what the cubby looks like. Perfect. And now our players have some extra legroom so they can be more comfortable while playing their favorite game, which is all we care about. It's super important. And that's what one side looks like. And again, what we do to one side, we do to the other side. So there we go. All right. This new sub base, we go ahead and give it a good sanding. And then we're going to add some cherry edge banding here. This is just iron-on edge banding. It's really great. Tape it to one side. And then I went over and I cut it off. And then we just kind of tape it on and iron it on. That's as easy as it gets. And then you trim off the excess with your little edge bander trimmer here, which is super helpful from Rockler. Gotta love Rockler. Perfect. And now we're going to chop up some more cherry. And this is going to be our thickness profile. Now, I don't know if the formal word for this is thickness profile or apron or underskirt, but this is the piece that we're adding to the bottom of the table to give it the appearance that it's thicker than it really is. It's a great way to make furniture with 4/4 lumber and just make it appear thicker is by adding this thickness profile. And again, this is all relative measuring because that's the easiest and most accurate way to do it. Clamp this together and tacked it in place with glue and brad nails. And then we went ahead and we belt sanded the entire perimeter just so we have one even surface. Be careful when you're belt sanding. Belt sanders have a tendency to sometimes dig into the wood, so just keep it even, keep it flat, and move at a steady, consistent, constant pace. Never stay in one area for too long. That's my tip for belt sanding. And now we're just going to do a flush trim with the router here. We added that thickness profile just a hair thicker outside the edge of the table, so that way we could come back with the edge flush trim bit and make it flush. As you see here, that little triangle is what I was telling you about earlier with the trim, the problem that we had. Now, the way that I solved this, instead of, disassembling the entire trim piece and maybe mounting the maple and then cutting and then mounting the cherry after, I went ahead and I chiseled out every single corner because every single corner was off because the angles were not complementary to one another. And I did this entire process on all the corners, but it was simple. It didn't take that long. What I did was you mark out with your knife, you go ahead and chisel that out, and I just kind of removed and hogged out some material. I didn't go too deep. I wasn't removing the entire piece. I was just removing a little bit there, and then I took some cherry veneer, some CA glue, form fit that in place, and I went ahead and added another strip of cherry veneer. And this is just a band-aid for a mistake that didn't need to happen, but it did, so we want to make sure we do a good job of covering it up here. And sand it, add some glue, and sand it without dust collection so that sawdust can get into those cracks there. Okay, this is the hardest part of the entire table build I have found out. It was very difficult, but definitely worth doing. So I added a 45-degree engraving bit to my router, hooked up the router to the track that the track saw's on, and then followed and routed out a small groove, maybe 1/16 of an inch deep, along the perimeter of the maple trim on the inside and outside perimeter. And sometimes I had to make multiple passes, and I'm just showing you how I did it here. It was very tedious because I had to follow that perimeter line exactly. Thankfully, I had the track. I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have the track. I think I went a little bit deeper than 1/16 of an inch. Maybe an 1/8 of an inch deep is how deep we went. And again, inside and outside of the maple along the entire perimeter of the entire table. And route, make sure it's deep enough. If not, then we make it a little bit deeper and route again and just keep going around the entire table. It's very tedious lining this up, making sure it was exactly perfect and exactly on that line. It took about 4 or 5 practice passes just to make sure it was on the line the entire path all the way down. And if it doesn't, then we adjust it accordingly. Made sure to clamp that track in place and did the inside and then we did the outside. And now what we're doing is we're taking pewter wire, and insetting it, inlaying it into that groove that we just cut with the 45-degree engraving bit. I press it in place and then hammer it in place. And then we use CA glue to glue the whole piece down. I used thin CA glue because it's very viscous, and not viscous, the thinner one, like water. And it could get in between the cracks. And CA glue will have a capillary effect and suck that pewter wire into the crack and hold it in place very, very well. Now you could do this with maybe some epoxy or some JB Weld, but I used CA glue and it worked out great. And then I went ahead and sanded the wire down flush to the tabletop, so it is a flush metal inlay around the entire perimeter of the entire trim of the tabletop, and I thought it looked beautiful. Now went over and just started sanding. How sanding goes, just sanding. At this point, I really wish I had a wider sander. I have the Festool Rotex 125. I really wish I had the 150, but again, that's okay. That's on me. I bought the wrong one. So large table surfaces like this, that wider one would really be nice. Okay, here I took a piece of acrylic down to my local laser shop. It's actually the community shop. I have a membership there. It's great. Shout out Assembly. And my good friend Maz helped me cut out the client's logo on acrylic, and I'll show you why here in just a second. Now I jumped on top of the tabletop. I'm cutting out a circle. And if you noticed, the logo I cut out was also a circle with the acrylic. So maybe you could guess that I'm adding the acrylic logo to the center of this tabletop, just like that. Perfect. Okay, get out of the way. Nice. Now it doesn't look like acrylic because it's covered in paper to protect the acrylic, so don't worry about that right now. We'll get back to that. I added some figure 8 fasteners along the edge of the sub base to hold the tabletop down into it, just like that. And then it became time to stain. This is 50% Barn Red, 50% English Chestnut. It was a color that my client and I designed and picked out and worked on together. After about maybe 15 or so samples, we decided that this one looked the best. Stain the entire table. Remember that light box? Put it underneath the circle cutout we just made. And maybe you're putting 2 and 2 together that we're putting acrylic there so the light can shine through. And you're exactly right. But first we have to paint our acrylic sheet. Now I color matched our maple at the paint store. So that's what I sprayed on here. So that way, nice complementary color right in the middle. And I cut out 2 logos, painted one of them, and then left the other one clear. And then kind of glued those pieces in place underneath the light box, took this video on the iPhone, and that's what it looked like with the light shining through. Now this is in daylight, literally in daylight. My shop door is open behind me and it still looks fantastic. Now it's time to spray. I use a 2-part Acrylico finish. I have no idea where I bought it. Somewhere at a finish store in San Antonio, Texas, because I needed it for a bar and I had gallons of it. And it's brilliant. I love this finish. I'd probably never use anything else. This is what the finish looks like. And now it's finally time to get this table over to my client's house and deliver it. And again, it's in pieces, which makes it so much easier for delivery. Boom, look at this, installed in the client's home with the light box. Have that beautiful blue glow coming through the light box on the logo. Have the cubbies that we need. That's our pewter inlays that we did. And this is the finished table. And this is how we built the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game table. Thank you for watching.